Welcome, everybody, to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell here with my co host, Misty Winston. And we are joined today by UK-based journalist and author Iain Davis. Iain has written a number of books, including most recently Pseudo Pandemic, New Normal Technocracy. And he's also authored a piece which recently came out on ukcolumn.org and which will form the basis of most of our conversation today. And that piece is entitled The Not So Great Carbon Reset, Part 2. Iain, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
How are you holding up at the beginning of Davos Agenda 2022 week?
Oh, well, it's been fantastic to watch Xi Jinping announce the whole thing. And I made a comment earlier. It always surprises me that when you talk about something such as the for want of a better expression, the Great Reset agenda, often people that scoff at you for doing that, they'll come back at you and say, well, you're believing some sort of secret conspiracy. You think, well, it's not exactly a secret, is it?
Right.
I mean, it couldn't be more in your face than that. I mean, it's a published policy agenda. And seeing the usual suspects roll out at Davos to tell us all how we are going to go and how our future is going to unfold, which they've already decided.
Right. The premier annual gathering of the world's foremost maniacs is how I like to term it.
Yeah, that's a good.
So, go ahead.
No, you carry on.
So, going off of that, I want to use your piece as sort of an outline for our conversation, because what your piece details is, in my mind, the end game of this COVID-19 madness we've been enduring for the past 2 years. Would you agree?
I think it's as far as my research has taken me in terms of being able to predict where we're going in the future. I think there are other aspects, perhaps, that there are longer term objectives. I think something that I don't mention much in that article is the transhumanist aspect of where this is ultimately heading. And if we look at, we're talking about what Schwab's written. I mean, obviously we've got the COVID-19, the Great Reset, but also the Fourth Industrial Revolution, in which he's quite rabid about transhumanism. So I think ultimately, and I don't want to heap everything on Schwab's shoulders, because I'm not suggesting for one moment that he's kind of like in charge of everything, but he's a window through which we get a glimpse of the kind of ideas that they're mulling over and the agenda that they've got planned. And certainly transhumanism is part of that. So that's perhaps beyond what I've written in the article. But in the next few years, I mean, certainly there seems to be a kind of that 2030 goal. It seems to be that within that time frame we can expect to see a lot of these policies, net zero in the UK policies, rolled out.
Right. So, getting back to your piece and the conversation surrounding that, I'm wondering if we can start by defining a few terms for viewers and listeners who may not be familiar with them. So, how do you define the Global Public-Private Partnership, or GPPP, or GP3, as you often put it in your piece?
Yeah, G3P, I think I said in the
G3P.
Because I was talking about GPPP and people were going, well, that's a bit of a mouthful. Is there a better way of G3? Let's call it G3P. It's a network of global corporations, NGOs, governments, think tanks, philanthropic foundations, international charities, and so forth, who are working together to develop what I would call policy agendas. So, and I would draw a distinction between a policy agenda in the form of governance, as contrasted to government, And those policy, that collective, for which, historically, that collective, the term global public-private partnership has been used by the World Health Organization and used in documents talking about it. It was very much centered on how global health would be managed in terms of public health. And there's a history that goes back. There's a couple of researchers wrote a paper in 2010, I think, or maybe earlier 2000, Buse and Walt, who wrote a kind of an official history of what you might call the global public-private partnership. But and all I've done really is that I've used that model to explain the flow of policy around the world. So we can see, for example, with what was sustainable development and Agenda 2030 and Agenda 21, we can see those policy ideas emanating, all the way back to, well, even before, but certainly back to the Club of Rome. And then moving forward, those ideas get kicked around in the think tanks, of which obviously the Club of Rome is one, but not the only one. And then that gets formed into a policy, broadly into a policy framework that we might call Agenda 21 or Agenda 2030. And then that policy framework, which is not legislation, it's not law, it's not government, it's just governance at a centralized world level, then gets cascaded down through national governments, where, and this is why we have simultaneously, which we've just seen with COVID-19, we have the same policies, more or less, in the same countries simultaneously. Well, that's because it's coming from a centralized point, a world governance level, is cascading down through government. Government then converts that into what we might call hard and fast policy, some of which can become legislation to enforce the policy. And then we experience it as the, if you like, the consumers or the subjects of policy, as rules from the government and mandates, and you will do this and you will do that. So what the global public-private partnership model, the G3P model, shows is how governance at a centralized global level creates policy, which then flows around the world.
I think that's such an amazing distinction too, the difference between governance and government. I don't think a lot of people think of that because, those who are sort of, I don't even know what the word is to use, but in charge of or pushing out these sort of ideas, they're not elected. They in most cases, they're not even known. Most people have no idea who these people are. They don't know what their names are, what positions they hold, what companies they work for. They have nothing. They have no idea about who these people are. So I think that that's a really key distinction to make between governance and government. I don't think a lot of people have been talking about that. And I love the fact that I don't even like the idea that we're consumers of it. We are the subjects. We have very little, it's not like a choice. We have no choice. When you're a consumer of something, generally speaking, there's a choice. You have options. There's no options here. It's really just forced upon us. But I love that there's a distinction being made between governance and government. So, kudos for that.
But yeah, and I think another aspect of that as well is if you're in the realm of creating governance, then no one can blame you. You can't be held liable for the decisions that you make, because at the end of the day, you can say, oh well, it was only an idea.
Right.
Effectively, it was only an idea, but of course, this idea, however you want to put it, is enforced. And it's enforced through economics. It's enforced through lobbying. It's enforced through the use, effectively, the people that have the power on the earth to create money from absolutely nothing have the power to, even though they claim it's just a policy agenda or an idea, they have the economic might to be able to enforce that policy. So on the one hand, it enables them to claim or to dodge liability, But on the other hand, they also have all the resources they need to enforce it. So it's a con.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Which is how you so aptly describe it in your piece, your most recent piece
Which I
for
dropped the link in the chat if anybody wants to check it out. It's there in the chat.
ukcolumn.org.
Yeah, and it's also in the show notes as well for everybody.
So this heist involves global governance, G3P. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, well, whatever. I mean,
I'm always
easier?
tempted to say GP3, but G3P. I want to stick with your nomenclature.
Yeah,
But
G3PA is, yes.
Their heist is part of that is them trying to sell us on several distinct notions, or policies is probably a better word, especially concerning climate change. So can you talk about that a little bit, as well as what happened, not so much behind the scenes at COP26, but certainly did not receive as much coverage as Greta Thunberg and her coterie being angry in the streets?
Yeah, I think the idea. I mean, personally, this is my personal view. I don't accept the idea of anthropogenic global warming. I do not believe that CO2, a trace gas, is controlling the Earth's climate. I think it's far more likely that it's the sun. However, I don't think that matters, because I think even the people who accept and believe wholeheartedly in the need to maybe perhaps for net zero policy, or for us to reduce our carbon footprints, the people who are running the agenda aren't interested in that. That is not what they are pursuing. They're not pursuing this in any genuine sense of trying to save the environment or save the planet. They are seeing this first and foremost as a market creation opportunity. So this is an opportunity to create a market the likes of which the Earth has never seen before. So that's why when a lot of people looked at COP26, a lot of people said or felt or expressed the opinion that it was a failure. And the reason that they felt it was a failure is because, there was nothing, for example, the lack of agreement on coal, for example. So people that were worried, who were worried about the environment and believe in anthropogenic global warming, were disappointed because there was no agreement on coal. And then there were other comments about people saying, well, the Chinese delegation, they didn't send, the Premier Xi Jinping didn't go, Putin didn't go, so people were reading this as a lack of interest, a failure of the meeting of minds. But it's only a failure if you think that is the purpose of COP26. If you understand that the purpose of all the COP meetings really is to create a new market, a new global market, and to fundamentally shift the basis of the global economy to a different model, then everything that happened at COP26 it couldn't have gone better for the people who are pursuing that agenda. So one of the things that was stated at the big kind of, I suppose, the kind of headline that came out of the end of COP26 was Mark Carney's announcement of GFANZ, which was the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, I believe. So that got all the headlines, and there was some dodgy accountancy that had gone on there, and I think quite a few observers picked that up and said, well, these numbers don't really add up. This doesn't make a lot of sense. But immediately following Carney, somebody that had no real kind of press coverage, a guy called Erkki Liikanen was the next speaker after Carney. Now he's head of the IFRS, which is the international, I can't remember, but he's the head of the IFRS, and he was talking about the establishment of something called the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is an accountancy venture that would enable the earth, I suppose what the best way of putting it, but nature would enable an accountancy system that would enable you to apply a financial market value to nature. That's what he was announcing. So he announced that this would be set up. This has been established, the ISSB, and that would sit next to something called the IASB. These two groups would work in tandem together. Well, the IASB is the International Accountancy Standards Board. Now, that is a private organization. It is funded solely by private venture capital. That is the IASB. So this private group is going to be working with this ISSB group, who are going to set the accountancy standards for rating natural assets. And there's something that Whitney Webb spoke about a lot. These natural assets will then be bundled into what they're calling natural asset companies, which really is just a term for, it's a financial investment vehicle. That's all it is really. But this is absolutely crucial, what Likkonen said, because if we go all the way back to Agenda 21, there are many things that came out of Agenda 21, but one of the things that they came out was this notion, and they called it the basis for action.
And just to clarify, Agenda 21 came out of the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, 30 years ago this year, correct?
Yes, yeah. So this is 30 years ago. So they said that they wanted to create something called the basis for action. And the basis for action was exactly what I've just recounted to you. It was creating, they wanted to create some sort of accountancy system to enable them to apply a financial value to nature. That was their plan 30 years ago. So what they announced at COP26 was the fulfillment of that plan. So they now have their basis for action. So they're now going ahead with capitalizing and financializing literally the earth. Every single natural resource on earth, both the things that we own, I think often people talk about that very bad PR stunt by the World Economic Forum. You'll own nothing and you'll be happy.
Yes.
But that's what this is about. That's what this is about. They made a mistake with their PR, but nonetheless, it was accurate. That is what this is about, because they want to turn everything into a service. So everything you currently own will become a service that you will buy in. So you won't own a car. It'll be like some kind of mega Uber. You'll just order it and it will come and pick you up. But of course, then you're not in control of your own freedom of movement. You're relying on a third party. So what they want to do is they want to make you rely on a third party for everything, because then you're no longer in control of it. The third party, which they can have influence over, is then in control of your life. But another big part of that is the creation of ecosystem services. So, for example, which will be bundled into these asset companies. So, for example, if you and I see a forest, we see a beautiful part of nature, we see biodiversity, we see all the many aspects of the environment that a forest adds to. They see a carbon sequestration service. So that forest can be given a value in terms of its carbon sequestration value. So then that can be bundled into a natural asset company. Then they can use the rating system, which goes back to the World Economic Stakeholder Capitalism metrics, which are using something called ESG ratings to rate that asset. And then that will determine how much investment goes into that asset or how much or doesn't. So you're controlling the flow of capital because they've got centralized control over the asset rating system. So they are controlling who invests in what and where and when. And then they are able to also control the supply side or set the demand side. I mean, they can do anything. I mean, once this system is up and running, especially if they bring in CBDC, then they're going to control both the supply and the demand side of the global economy. And I would suggest that is, well, it's game over for human freedom, really.
Yes. And CBDC, just to clarify, is a digital currency, a global digital currency, correct? That's what that means?
Yes, central bank digital currency. Yeah, which
is where we're headed rather rapidly.
Yeah, that's definitely coming. Yeah.
Yes, for sure.
And that's where the so-called vaccine passports come into play, which perhaps we can touch on in a little bit. But before we get to that, I want to ask you, why do you think, or maybe not why do you think, because I think there are very clear market reasons and things that have happened in the global financial markets that are driving them now to do this. So can you elaborate on that, particularly what happened in late 2019 and then transitioning into early 2020 when the pseudo pandemic was essentially rolled out worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it goes back further than that. I would say to 2008, 2007, 2008, when we had the financial crash. Often commentators said, that the global economy nearly collapsed. Well, I would suggest it did collapse. It didn't nearly collapse. It did collapse. And since then, it's been on life support. And it's only been on life support because they've been pumping money into it. So they've been printing money, which they can print out of thin air. So they've been printing money and feeding that into the financial markets to keep them afloat and to give the impression that we still have some sort of functioning, productive economy. In 2019, so one of the marked things that happened in 2008 that set the alarm bells ringing was the collapse of something called the repo market. So the repo market is the repossession market, or I can't remember what repo stands for now, but it's a short-term bond market, which is a 24-hour short-term bond market that investors can go into. They can collateralize a loan or collateralize a bond, and they'll get a quick return on that the next day. So it's like the oil in an engine. It keeps the banking system ticking over. Well, in 2008, one of the problems with the repo market, and one of the problems with the global crash, was that repo market started seizing up. If we move forward to 20, and then all they were doing from then was just flooding the market with money to try and keep things ticking along. In 2019, the same thing happened again. The repo market came to a halt. The problem was that the big American banks were holding, I think, more than 50% of all government bonds were held by 3 banks. Well, this is a bond trading market. So these banks were in danger of becoming their own customers. So the whole thing ground to a halt. And in one day, I think the repo rate was something like normally around about 2%. It went up to 10% in one day. And even when they put it up to 10%, investors still wouldn't go into it. So they were in big trouble at this point.
And by 10%, do you mean rate of return?
Yeah, the rate of return. Yeah.
Okay.
So an investor would invest in a bond in the repo market, and they get 2% on that in 24 hours. Well, it crashed, and they put it up to 10% to try and encourage people to come in. But investors still didn't come in. And the reason that they didn't come in was that the market was heavily skewed towards the big banks who were holding all the bonds, and all the other banks, which often are the people who invest in the repo markets, the commercial banks, the smaller commercial banks, and investors were holding so much liquidity because of all the money printing that had been going on, that they didn't need it. They thought, we don't need to go into it. So the whole thing started grinding down. Now, the ironic thing about that And I still, in my own mind, I don't know how contrived. I haven't decided really whether I think that was contrived or not. I suspect it might have been. And the reason that I think it may have been is that about a month before that, at Jackson Hole in Wyoming, BlackRock presented their paper effectively talking about going direct, which meant central bank money being pumped into the functioning market, into the capital markets and into the financial markets, which it normally wouldn't do. But this is what and the reason that they did that, Mark Carney was one of the people that spoke, and he was speaking to Ben Bernanke at the time at the Jackson Hole meeting, and he said basically they said that I think the quote that Carney said was, the international monetary and financial system is finished, it's over. And the quote, the words he was the center cannot hold. And when he was talking to Bernanke, he said, this is, there's some urgency. I echo the sentiments that you've said, Bernanke. There is a sense of urgency. We need to get on top of this now. So they were clearly envisioning the collapse of the global international monetary and financial system. Had things continued the way they were going, I think we probably would have seen that collapse in 2020, 2021. So they needed a catalyst to stave off that collapse until they got all their ducks lined up and were ready to put in the new model, which is what they announced at COP26. They weren't ready. So they needed a catalyst. Lo and behold, a month later, the repo market goes down, which then triggered the going direct plan presented by BlackRock. And they were then able to start money printing on a just silly scale. It just went mental.
Yes.
Right. So they just started pumping money on a. And one thing that I think that is interesting about, it's obvious when you think about it, when they're flooding the global economy with that much liquidity, they know. I mean, some people believe in the magic money tree or modern monetary theory, but if you pump that much money into an economy, you have to devalue all the currency. You can't. Personally, I don't think there's any doubt about that. So in doing that, they are kind of acknowledging that the economy as we know it, and money as we know it, certainly in terms of the dollar, is finished. They've got no interest in it anymore because they're committing monetary suicide, and openly, but on a vast scale.
So how does that, if at all, tie to the inflation that the US in particular has been experiencing, although inflation has been pretty much skyrocketing around the world for the past 2 years? Is that a result of this flooding the market at all? Is there any connection there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. People that believe in modern monetary theory would say that I'm wrong. They would say, no, it's perfectly possible to inflate the monetary supply and manage inflation through setting the base rate and the interest rates and everything like that. Personally, I disagree with that. Personally, I think if there's that much money floating around, then obviously you're going to push prices up, because if everybody's got more money, then on the demand side of things, you're setting a value on the demand side of the equation. Well, it's a seller's market, so it becomes a seller's market, and in a seller's market, in a capitalist seller's market, prices go up. If they can charge more for a product, they will charge more for a product or a service or investments or interest rates. And if there's plenty of liquidity about, especially in the financial markets, I think inflation is nailed on certainty. But as I said, a lot of economists like Mariana Mazzucato and people like that who work for the World Economic Forum, who push this idea of modern monetary theory or the magic money tree, depending on how you want to look at it, would disagree with that.
They would, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Yes, they would. Yeah, I think what really terrifies me about all of this is that, first of all, that they're so depthly getting away with it, essentially. I mean, at least it appears that way so far. But also that this really does throw all of the power into the hands of the banks. We no longer have, we really don't have actual government now. We have, it is taxation without representation at this point. All of those things, but this whole going direct system that they're hoping to implement, this really does, it really levels all of us, and it puts all of the power into the hands of a very, very tiny few amount of people who, again, are not elected. As we mentioned earlier, these are people who are unelected. They come up with the ideas, the thoughts, the policies, and then it kind of then filters down through. And it's, I don't know. It's hard for me to maintain any level of hope at this point. It feels like we're so very far behind, and they're really, I don't know. It just seems like the propaganda that the level of propaganda that they have in this country and their ability to maintain narrative control is really solid, and it's really difficult to, we can't even have these conversations. There's a very good chance that we could get taken off of YouTube just for talking about it. So, I guess I'm just kind of wondering, do you see any hope as far as like being able to actively combat this, or do you think we're too far gone?
I think I'm very hopeful that we can combat this, and I think that we need to understand that what they're doing at the moment was very, very, very high risk. So why would you take such a massive gamble? You take a massive gamble because you're in trouble.
Yeah.
You've got a problem. And their problem was that the things that they've been telling us for the last 150 years were falling apart. So their choice was face global unrest or do something to try and,
that's fair. I see that.
The problem is that they've been aware of this for a long time.
Yeah.
So they've had a contingency plan. You can go, as we said, you can go all the way back to the World Economic Forum, 1970. So that's 50 odd years ago. So they've been preparing for this for a long time. But nonetheless, I think you can say that the repo market collapse was a trigger. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. But clearly, this is a gamble. When you look at so I suppose that goes back to the thing that why COVID-19? Why would they bother with that? What's that all about? I suppose if you're going to introduce a complete transformation of everything that we know in terms of the way our economy works, in terms of the way that we go about doing business, you need to get some sort of control mechanism in place first, because otherwise the people are going to be uncontrollable. So what they wanted to introduce with COVID, I strongly feel, is a biosecurity state. So they wanted to get the control mechanism in place first before they can start moving on with the agenda. So COVID was the perfect catalyst to introduce that biosecurity state. The vaccines, I personally feel that Jesse was quite right. It's all about the vaccine passports, because the vaccine passports are basically just digital identity. And that's really what they're about. They want to get us all using and accepting the need for digital identity. In the UK, we've had about 3 or 4 votes in the last 30 years on national identity cards, and every time it's defeated. So they can't present it to us as an argument. They can't say to us, will you accept digital identity cards? Because I imagine it's very, and more so in the United States, I would have thought, you're far more fiercely independent than British people are generally.
Well, I thought so too.
Well, yeah, I guess so did I.
Yeah. But I guess you do have a good point. And actually, I listened to your interview with Whitney Webb that you did, I don't know, a while ago, a couple weeks ago, maybe. And you mentioned that although these are incredibly powerful people, they are just still people.
Yeah.
They're not infallible. That this is something that I think that it just feels like it feels kind of hopeless because it feels like we're so far behind. That like you said, they've known this is coming for some time. They've been, preparing for it and planning for it and coming up with contingency plans. And most people have no idea what's actually happening. And sadly, many people are going along with, not even just going along with, but cheering on these really disgusting authoritarian measures. There was just a Rasmussen poll put out the other day where just an obscene amount of people were okay with like putting people who refuse the injections in prison or taking their kids away. And that's terrifying that there's that number of people who are not just complying, but cheering it on. It's really scary. So, I mean, I think that we are starting to see a level of people starting to break from that. I mean, the protests around the world are massive, which is really, it kind of gives me a certain level of hope. But I mean, I guess just maybe because I am in the States and it has been really sad. Like you said, we were supposed to be so fiercely independent, and that's really not been shown to be the case here. It's really sad.
I mean, one thing I would say is don't forget that we're all subject to the propaganda as well. So we all, I mean, obviously we know the people that are in our local community, and we mix in the local community, and we see people in shops wearing masks and all that kind of thing. But also the things that we're told, especially things by people like pollsters, are designed for people like us to feel isolated, despondent, alone, fragmented. That we are a target of this as much as the people that they want to convince to get the vaccines, so we're a big target of this as well. Now, recently in the UK, if you look at the statistics, there are about 54 million adults in the UK. So if we take children out of it, although some children have been vaccinated above 12, it's not by no means full coverage. So say 53 million adults in the UK, that out of them, about 47.9, nearly 48 million were vaccinated. So that we're talking about 5 or 6 million people who initially elected not to be vaccinated. So that's quite a small minority, but it was still, 13%, something like that, sort of 13%, something like that, of the population. But then we looked at the booster figures. So the booster campaign, now in the UK, on the booster campaign, they're basically having to just chuck boosters in the bin because the demand is not there. And the difference between who had 2 boosters and who had who had 2 vaccines and who had the booster, 3 vaccines in effect, is 12 million people. So now there's an additional 12 million people who obviously are not convinced by this narrative that they're selling. So that, if you take that as a percentage of the adult population of the UK, we're talking about a third of the UK adult population who buy going by what the government has said. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid recently said that you would need a booster in order to get your COVID pass, to get your COVID passport. That's going to be, he's now talking about prospectively shutting out of society a third of the population. Now, they can't do that.
No.
And they're not going to. So we are not isolated. They want us to think that we're isolated, and they want us to think that we're a tiny, tiny minority. But if we look at the statistics, even if you didn't have that sudden shift, even without that, we're still 10, 11% of the population. That's not nothing. And I don't know what, I haven't looked at the figures in the US. I'm only talking about the UK. But if you now look at the number of people who have declined the booster, why would you have 2 jabs and then not have the booster? It's obviously because people have had enough. So we're talking about a third Now that is a very different prospect. So what's happened in the UK? In the UK, they backed off the booster. They backed off on the vaccine passports. They're saying that, oh no, now we're thinking that we're not going to have vaccine passports. The Prime Minister has just recently said that there'll be no restrictions at all after March. So they're backpedaling quick. And I think that the reason they're backpedaling quick is because they're looking at the numbers. And if there's, I mean, this is the UK Health Security Agency that put these statistics out. This is on the government's own COVID-19 dashboard. And it's quite obvious that nearly 12 million people who got 2 jabs have now decided they don't want the booster, knowing that would mean that they wouldn't get their vaccine passports. So they don't care about that either. So I game on, I say.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look at the UK Health Security Agency's weekly reports, I suppose you could call them, which are compared to what the CDC puts out, they're transparent what's coming from the UK. You can look at the numbers on a weekly or bi-weekly basis and see that most of the cases of COVID-19, most of the hospitalizations and most of the deaths are now very heavily on the side of the injected. And I don't know how many people in the UK are looking at those numbers and how often, but the evidence is there for anybody to see. Anybody can access those reports online. And the numbers are staggering as far as how slanted the illness is toward those who've gotten the injections, whether 2 or even 3 at this point. And of course, there's the trickery that's in there of you not being considered fully vaccinated unless it's 14 or more days after you've been injected. But even with that, the numbers don't lie. And again, whether or not the UK public is looking at those numbers or not, as you said, people are waking up and game on for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and as you were saying earlier, the demonstrations in London, I attended one of them. They were absolutely enormous.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, we're definitely talking at least 500,000 people.
That's
insane. And there were I think there were about five of them, and yet the media in the UK managed nothing. They managed not to report that. I mean, this is like one of the biggest. This is the biggest demonstration since the Iraq War, probably.
Yeah. Yes, I would say.
And they managed to just. I mean, I must admit, even I was surprised by that. I thought, wow,
it's amazing.
Nothing.
Yes, that's amazing. I mean, seriously, to have 500,000, whatever, however many tons of people, and not just in London, but in all across the globe.
London,
and there's not a peep on mainstream media. I mean, the Netherlands, tiny little place. Thousands upon thousands of people in the streets on a regular basis, and not a peep from mainstream media. It's insanity. I mean, it's not surprising, really. Our media is basically just the propaganda arm of the global elite, or whatever you want to call them. But it is really fascinating that they somehow managed to not cover something as giant as, millions of people around the globe fighting back against this kind of stuff. Not a word. I mean, in the States too, not on CNN, not on MSNBC, not on Fox News, none of them talk about it ever. Not a word.
No. And which also, I mean, talking about, the kind of the centralized authority, which I've called the G3P, that is ruling the planet. That's another example, isn't it? How could you possibly have what, quote unquote, an independent media, which globally, simultaneously, doesn't report some of the biggest civil actions in its society's history? Or none of them. None of them. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's obviously coordinated. It's obviously centrally coordinated on a global level. I don't see how anyone can rationally argue against that.
No, our media is entirely broken. I mean, it's no different than how they didn't cover the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, or the Julian Assange trial. They don't cover that. It's the historic court case on press freedom. Nobody's covering that. You're journalists, and nobody's covering that. It is very blatantly obvious, and it's just it's kind of amusing, honestly, to watch them scramble to dodge these subjects and to not cover them. They'll cover anything else. To not cover it. Yeah, it's funny.
But it makes sense that they would do that, given that in the global public-private partnership schema, they are part of the lower tier of propaganda disseminators. They disseminate propaganda in favor of the policies that are decided upon way above them. And you've shown that in a graphic you've created, which is included in the ukcolumn.org piece. But
which I'll drop in the chat again for everybody.
Given that, it's not surprising that they would not only not cover these protests, but even fabricate coverage of them. There was the instance in Italy, I believe it was, where a plaza was filled with protesters, but on one of the mainstream media outlets' live feeds, they had it so it looked like nobody was in the plaza.
They did that in New Zealand as well. My friend Alex lives there, and they did a story, and they said it was like a photo with it didn't look like very many people, and it said hundreds of people in the streets. And my friend Alex posted a video, and she's like hundreds, and it's like blocks long of people. She's like, there's thousands, if not like tens of thousands of people in the streets, and they've managed to like turn it into this, hundreds of people.
Yeah, I think it was Sky in the UK. They did a report where they basically let the march go past and then sort of joined at the back of the march, the sort of people that were right at the back that were kind of following because they didn't really know what was going on. And they joined them, so they just had a few stragglers around them, and then filmed it and put that out as saying there was a small demonstration in London today, where meanwhile in front of them, as far as the eye could see, it was wall to wall people, and they just lied, just lied.
Yeah.
But of course, because the point about that is something going back to what you were saying, Misty, earlier, is the average person sitting at home who's perhaps the only person in their family who is thinking, hang on a minute, this doesn't make a lot of sense, who feels isolated because everybody around them is fully on board. They sit there watching the news, and all they get from that is that, I am in a tiny minority. It's reinforcing that idea. So, and I think the point is they know that the person sitting at home on their own are not in a tiny minority. Otherwise, they wouldn't be frightened of showing the march. They don't want them to know that they're not isolated, that they're not alone, that there is a massive amount of people out there who do not agree. So I think we can be hopeful, I think.
Right.
Yeah,
and we have
for
to
sure.
we have to continue resisting, refusing to comply. And on that note, why is it so important that we refuse to go along with CBDCs?
CBDCs, if we're talking about, so they want to restructure the global economy, which is something that I spoke about in the article, and the international monetary and financial system. So part of that is the rollout of central bank digital currency. So central bank digital currency, I've got no doubt when it is rolled out, it will be sold to us as some kind of stable coin or something like that, some sort of crypto type kind of thing. It is based on blockchain technology, just like cryptocurrencies, but it's a fundamentally different way of using blockchain technology. So in blockchain technology, it's a fairly egalitarian system. You and I make a transaction, anonymous nodes do a checksum, validate the transaction. We have no control over it. It's all done anonymously. It's a very egalitarian, fair way of doing business, or vehicle for doing monetary exchange and doing business. If you control the nodes, as in you have gateways to the blockchain, which you are in control of, and you are controlling the checksum calculations, then you have control of every single transaction. So if we accept CBDC, people have called it programmable money. So what this means is it's not your money for a start. It's a liability of the central banks. It's their liability. It's their money. So it's never yours. So the idea that you will ever have your own money ever again is gone if we have central bank digital currency. You won't. It'll belong to the bank, and you will be, if you like, permitted to use it. But you're permitted to use it under their auspices. So let's say you and I decide that we want to, you're on Rockfin or whatever, and I decide that I want to watch this chat that we're having on Rockfin, and I want to pay to watch it. With CBDC, they could, and with their algorithms that will obviously be controlling the whole system, they'll be able to identify me as a person that is watching the wrong kind of material, and literally stop me from being able to make that transaction. So I won't technologically be able to watch you. If we're talking say pay per view or whatever. So I wouldn't be able to make that transaction. My freedom of choice is gone. So if we, and that could go for anything. So one of the things that people are talking about at the moment with net zero is obviously we're moving to the idea of electric vehicles. At the moment, I've got a choice. I can go and buy a petrol vehicle, diesel or whatever, or if I can afford it, I can buy an electric vehicle. That's a choice that I make based on my understanding of what's important to me and to my family and to everything else. Because I've got cash in my pocket, so I can buy whatever I like with it. With CBDC, I won't be able to buy a car, a diesel car, or I won't be able. So there'd be no point in the manufacturers making them. So because I won't physically or technologically, I won't be able to buy one. I'll only be allowed to buy an electric car. So this is total global slavery. I think we need to be clear about that. It is global slavery. So that is what the head of the Bank of International Settlements. I've seen most people have seen it now. Augustin Carstens. He speech about how he couldn't wait, and we will have the technology to enforce that. He was salivating at the prospect of it, wasn't he? He was absolutely, he was delighted at what the power that this would give him to control, and his buddies to control everything. And that's what these people get off on. That's what they seek. They seek total dominion is what they're after.
Right. And I think you bring up a good point there, in that the money is important to them because it enables that total dominion. The money is not the end. The money is just a means to the end of dominion. So definitely we should keep our antennas up regarding CBDCs and anything that smacks of them. And we're probably going to see them continue to be rolled out. Although it seems like as of now, the infrastructure they need to do that is far from in place. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, technologically, it's not difficult, is it? The technological capability to do it is pretty straightforward. It's already been established. It's already existing technology. But yeah, they haven't rolled out the infrastructure yet. But they could. And it wouldn't be, I wouldn't, I mean, well, effectively what we're talking about are payment machines, aren't we? So, I mean, it wouldn't be difficult to roll that infrastructure out, but they haven't. And I'm sure when they introduce it, it will be in parallel. So it'll be optional.
I really think it's the consent hasn't been manufactured. They haven't gotten the public to a point where we would be accepting of such a thing yet.
Absolutely,
I mean, they're working towards that. And I think that's what so many people don't quite understand. It's they're obviously not, this has been slow walked for a very long time. As we mentioned, this is like 30 years they've been talking about this, longer really. So this is something that has been slow walked upon us for decades. And so it's not going to be blatant in your face. They're going to push us until we protest, and then they'll back off just enough so that we're content again. And then they'll push us a little bit further. And this is going to be something that is a progressive movement towards this end game. So, I mean, I think that's why it's so difficult, because if it isn't impacting somebody, in their face, it's really difficult to get people to understand or to care. It's such an abstract concept that it's not as in your face as, hey, I can't take my kid to the doctor because I can't afford it. And so when people are so focused on other things, it's hard to get people to realize where we're being led. We're being led. It's the frog in the pot metaphor. We are the frog in the pot right now. And so I think that's a big part of it.
Yeah, and that's a big part of why I wrote the book, because I wrote the pseudo pandemic because I wanted to catalogue the information that was, and now looking back at it, I mean, I was only up to about the first half of 2021, but I wanted to catalogue all the information that had not been disclosed during the first part of the pandemic. So all this information that was in the public domain, I mean, I didn't, nothing that I wrote about in that book wasn't in the public domain. As you were talking about the statistics from the Office of National Statistics and UXA and people like that, all of this stuff was out there, but no one was reporting it. No one, that's not true.
Yeah,
there were people that were reporting it, but they were all in the alternative media and so forth.
And they were all labeled as crazy conspiracy theorists.
And all called completely nuts, and talking about things like the Great Reset and things like that, called completely crazy. But so I thought, well, it's important to catalogue this, to put this together so that hopefully people that aren't aware of this information, that might be more disposed to reading about it rather than watching videos on Odyssey or whatever, would have a chance to familiarize themselves with something that as you quite rightly said, we tend to think about what we're going to do next week, or what we're going to do tomorrow, or what we're going to have for dinner tomorrow evening or whatever. These people think in terms of decades, in generations. They're thinking about long-term strategies. So we need to very quickly familiarize ourselves with those long-term strategies if we are going to be able to resist it. And I think we can resist it, but we just need to take agency for ourselves and take back our independence and say, well, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in your plans, your ideas. I'm not interested. I am going to, form my own. I'm going to go about my business as a reasonable, peaceful person, and I'm going to treat people with respect, and I'm going to treat people with goodwill, and I'm going to be an honest person, but I'm not going to do what you're telling me.
So in terms of them taking the long view, where in your mind does depopulation or reducing the population factor into this? And I ask that because we're increasingly seeing more evidence of intent behind the lethality of the injections. For example, Dr. Mike Yeadon just came out with some pretty damning information that he and his colleagues put together using VAERS data that shows differences in lethality rates or mortality rates, if you like, according to batch numbers for the Pfizer injections, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson, and I believe AstraZeneca as well. And Rainer Fulmick in Germany has been heading the Corona committee and putting a lot of this evidence together to bring a case in international criminal court against various top figures who he, and I agree with him, he charges are committing mass murder, crimes against humanity. Where in your mind, if at all, does an intent to reduce the Earth's population factor into what's been happening over the past 2 years and into what we've been talking about for the past hour?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say that batch data evidence is damning. I don't see how you could look at that and not see intent. I just, you know, I mean, if it's verifiable and as far as I can tell, it is. Yeah, that's damning stuff. I mean, in terms of a depopulation agenda, I think one of the things that I've written about elsewhere is the fact that this G3P, GP3, whatever you want to call it, is not held together because it's not a special, you know, it's not a fraternity. They're not working together because they're all mates and they all love each other and they're just as happily stab each other in the back as anybody else. It's just that they're working together because they've got a shared common interest, and that interest is more for them and less for everybody else. So that's what they're aiming for, and I don't know that they share an ethos necessarily, and I wouldn't say that they do. However, if you look back through some of the statements that people have said in the past, there's a clear thread of eugenics. So if there is an ethos there or a fundamental belief system, it looks to me like it's more likely than anything else to be eugenics. That's what they kind of believe. That's what they're pursuing. So you can look at the eugenics in many different ways. I mean, it doesn't necessarily infer depopulation. You know, it infers subjugation and control and a sense of entitled superiority for those that consider themselves to be beyond human. But it doesn't necessarily mean depopulation. And when I look at the scary thing I would suggest about the batch data is that when you look at that, that looks like someone that's experimenting with what's going to kill and what isn't.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, so what's the best one? No, this one kills loads. We'll put that one out. You know, that is clearly what it looks like.
Right. And the fact that they're largely mRNA injections, but also there's the adenovector, which could be considered a DNA injection. The fact that these are genetically modifying agents, there's only a very short step there in my mind from using those agents, experimenting with those agents on humans, and we don't know what kind of fundamental changes they cause to us genetically because the studies haven't been done, or if they've been done,
we don't know about it.
We don't know about it. But my point being that it's not a long step to take from there into transhumanism, which we talked about at the beginning of this conversation briefly. And you could even make an argument that these injections are transhumanist in a sense, because they are, as Klaus Schwab has said in interviews, changing who we are fundamentally, genetically. I mean, that is the essence of who we are, our genetic makeup. It's not all that we are, but scientifically speaking, it is the essence of who we are. And there is documentation, or there is a lot that's been said by well-respected geneticists to that effect, that these things are most likely changing people who are injected with them. We don't know how long, but they are changing them in some fundamental way. So,
well, there is definitely a transformation agenda. There's you know, that's the idea in many aspects. politically, socially, economically, and I would say individually as well, in terms of humanity. They intend to transform us. Now, so one of the things that I think, going back to, I don't know is the answer about how clear I am about the depopulation agenda. I'm not clear about that. But certainly, if you add things up together, so if you look, for example, at net zero policy. So net zero policy is based on the idea that we're going to rid ourselves of fossil fuel. There doesn't seem to be much of an idea about expanding our nuclear power generation program. Quite the opposite in the UK. They're actually cutting back on nuclear power generation. So are they suggesting that we're going to be able to run a modern industrial economy on windmills and sunshine? Which seems to be what they are suggesting. Well, clearly you can't unless there's a lot less people, in which case you probably could. But
Right.
you couldn't run a modern industrialized economy like the US or the UK or Europe or in Russia, China, anywhere on sunshine and windmills. It's not going to work. That's not enough energy. So it looks like depopulation would be hardwired into that calculation, unless there's some sort of energy technology that we're not aware of, which can replace. And then you talk about markets. So currently they need markets to make money, and those markets are us. So they create markets, partly us and partly the financial system. But the derivative market is not human, is it? I mean, the derivative market is just making money out of money. I mean, that's a whole different world. But fundamentally, the marketplace is us. Now, if you're expanding markets and you want to be able to market services to people, presumably you need people to market it to. So that would suggest that depopulation is not significantly in their interests. So I really don't know. I mean, you look at things like the Georgia Guidestones. I don't know anything about the Georgia Guidestones. I don't know who put them. What nobody does, do they? And I've never known what I made of that. I've never really kind of thought. I don't know whether I necessarily believe that this means anything really. But you have to say what's on there. What's written on the Georgia Guidestones is quite interesting. Looking at it in retrospect, it's very difficult to say. I really don't know about whether they have got any kind of firm commitment to depopulation. One day I think they do. The next day I look at things and think, no, maybe not.
Right.
Well, it's like in your piece, you bring up that, the Club of Rome, they're trying to kind of paint humanity as the enemy, in certain ways. And so that kind of, that makes me think that maybe that is part of, but I don't know where I stand on that either. I really don't. It's all very difficult to kind of wade through because it is so very vague.
I mean, one of the things that they don't need us for anymore, increasingly, is as workers. They don't need us as workers. That's true.
Yes.
They only need us really more as consumers. So really, it's about our value to them as consumers. Sometimes I think that gives us great power in terms of being able to choose how we act as their consumers. But sometimes, you look at it and think, well, if they've got this new economy which enables them to basically buy and sell parts of the earth as financial products, why do they need us?
Right.
Yeah.
It's a difficult.
That kind of leads into what you were talking, the global commons, and how they are, at one point that meant, like oceans and the atmosphere, and they are, increasingly adding things to that, under that umbrella, that broad definition, where they are going to have control over the, in like the internet, things like that, where they're going to kind of put these things under this umbrella of power and control, that they then get to decide, as like with the the digital currency, what you get to have access to, what parks and the internet, and that's all going to be based off of your social credit score and all of those things. So they really don't need us as workers anymore. I think that there's a lot of people who need to come to terms with that. They are going to be able to AI their way away from us.
Yeah. I mean,
very quickly.
They're and the global commons is very interesting, because the description of the global commons is the things that all life relies upon but no one owns. So we're talking about the air, the seas, the forests, the mountains, and they're talking about
space too,
that,
right?
Space.
So essentially the universe.
Yeah, they've already started divvying up the universe. I mean, that's quite a good observation, actually, because I mean that just illustrates. I mean, the one thing that you said, that these are people. They're not demigods. They're not. You're not magicians. They're just people, and that just shows you that they're quite a few of them are slightly unhinged.
Oh, I think most of them are full-on psychopaths.
Yeah.
I really do. I don't think that's hyperbolic to say. They are full-on psychopaths.
And a lot of
we've managed to elevate the worst amongst us to positions of power.
Yeah, is that a kakistocracy? I think, isn't it? Is that a kakistocracy? Is that
I think so. Yeah.
But definitely.
A lot of these psychopaths are meeting this week in Davos, or not in Davos, but virtually, for the Davos Agenda 2022. And yesterday, there was a panel that included one Anthony Fauci. I won't give him the respect of calling him a doctor, but he was on this panel, and this panel also included the CEO of Moderna, Stefan Bancel, I believe is how you pronounce his name, and a bunch of other luminaries, you could call them. And one of the things that came out of this is that even as we're seeing what looks like, at least on the surface, the COVID-19 pandemic dying out with Omicron, on this panel, they decided, Moderna announced actually, that it's developing a quote unquote vaccine booster for the autumn in the Northern Hemisphere that's going to combine a flu quote unquote vaccine with a coronavirus quote unquote vaccine. So they're still pushing that agenda, even though at least on the surface it seems to be faltering. But then if you also take a look at the World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report for 2022, which was released a little over a week ago, or maybe 2 weeks, a couple of weeks ago, they have in there a list of the top 10 risks over the next 10 years. And infectious diseases is listed as number 6. And 5 out of those 10, I believe, involve the environment or climate change and failure to act. So it seems like they are still pushing the pseudo-pandemic narrative, but they're getting ready to pivot to the climate as the next emergency to wield their authoritarian power. So I'm wondering what you make of that and where you see this going, at least in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've predicted that I think we'll see more of is more vilification of the so-called anti-vaxxers. But I think we might start seeing moves towards claims about violent extremism amongst those that oppose the pro-freedom protesters will suddenly become violent extremists. And well, not suddenly, because that's a narrative that has been building for at least 4 years, 5 years. So that I think we're going to see something like that. I think the purpose of getting us to this point has been to get us accustomed to the behavioural commitments that we need to make. So I think a big part of the COVID-19 scam was to get us used to reacting to government emergency announcements. So the government, so I mean, the recently the G7 put out a pandemic preparedness document called the 100-day pandemic or something like that.
Right.
So
Bill Gates was involved with that.
Exactly. Well, Melinda Gates was co-signature on the précis, but they
Can you describe that a little bit, because it's absolutely ludicrous when you get into the details. Yeah,
the 100-day thing. I haven't familiarized myself with it very much. I only saw it the other day on UK Column, so I've yet to read that. What perhaps you can. What kind of stuff have they put in there?
Well, I haven't read it, but I was just wanting to get your comment on the fact that part of the 100 days, so it involves responding to the next pandemic more quickly than the current pandemic was responded to, and that entails doing so within the first 100 days of declaring a pandemic. And part of the first 100 days involves the rollout of quote unquote vaccines. So this is like warp speed on steroids, Operation Warp Speed on steroids, what they're proposing. And it's on its face, when you look at the details, insofar as I've looked at them, it's just absolutely ludicrous and a recipe for disaster, given what we have seen happen over the past 2 years. And it's like these people really have no bones about showing themselves as delusional maniacs.
No, well, because most people, if you point that out, just can't believe it, can they? You say, well, these people are delusional maniacs, and they go, well, that can't be true. It can't be true.
Bill Gates is such a nice guy. He wears a sweater.
He's such a nice guy. Yeah,
he's a nerd. It's fine. Yeah.
But I mean, so to your question, what you were talking about, how to perceive this coming in, say, 2022 and perhaps 2023 and beyond, they've already got something called the rapid response mechanism. So the rapid response mechanism was something that the G7 set up to have an agreed narrative. So something would happen, the G7 would state, they would decide what the agreed narrative was. Then obviously we've got things like the Trusted News Initiative. So the Trusted News, so all of this is centrally coordinated at a global level. So then you've got the Trusted News Initiative, whose role it would then be to disseminate the rapid response agenda globally. And then you've got things like the 100-day pandemic ready to step in there and create the panic. So in 100 days, we have a rapid response mechanism agreement on what the story is. Then we'd have the Trusted News agenda pumping that out globally. And then we'd have the 100-day pandemic approach, because I'm sure it won't just stop at pandemics. It'll be the 100-day climate crisis, the 100-day bioweapons attack, the 100-day,
cyber pandemic,
the cyber pandemic, the financial collapse. So every time an opportunity comes along, whether it's engineered or whether it's it occurs, it genuinely occurs, whatever, whenever the opportunity arises, they have now got all the mechanisms in place they need to have blanket coverage, all rolling out, all coordinated globally. And so we come back to the point of COVID-19. So we have been programmed on how we are going to respond to that. So they've now told us that, okay, so this is the hoops that you have to jump through. We've just decreed this. These are the things you have to do. You're accustomed to this now. You've got to go to the test centres. You've got to go to the food banks. You've got to do this. So off you trot. Here's your instructions. Get on with it. And that is, I think, increasingly what we're going to see. And I think you hit the nail right on the head when you were talking about climate, because I don't think we're very far away from the first climate lockdown. So, or I mean, even they were talking about. I mean, I can't remember what it was. I think it might have even been around the discussion on UK Column around the 100-day document, where somebody was already talking in there about and this is something that Public Health England, who no longer exists, said. Public Health England were running a document only shortly before COVID-19 that was saying that climate change, so this is a public health body, they were saying that climate change is the most significant threat to public health in Britain. So they're already linking climate change to health.
Well, and if you remember, there was a time at near the beginning of the pandemic where they were talking about how, with everybody being locked down, look, the environment is thriving. Look, it's doing so much better. So they've already kind of set the stage for that. Where, well, if we all just stay home, look, we can help improve climate, deal with climate change. So there's already been this kind of, it's behavior modification.
Make the flu disappear.
Yeah, the flu disappear. Yeah, I mean, it's already been kind of put out there into the ether that oh, but look, carbon emissions went down, and look, the trees are growing. All of these things have been kind of already put into people's subconscious that if we just stay home, then so I think that their climate lockdowns aren't far.
No, and I think that the part about the COVID pandemic whole thing has just been a big part of it. Is that behavior modification preparing us to adapt to the changes that they want to roll out? So they're sort of training us really like rats in a maze to adapt to whatever they want to do. So right. I think that the fact that the pandemic, I mean, you think what a tremendous effort this must have been to keep this together just this far. I mean, to control all of this to this point must have put a tremendous strain even on their resources. So they must be thinking at some point we can't carry on with this. At some point we have to back off a bit, regather ourselves, regather our forces, get ourselves together, ready for the next push. So and it has that psychological mechanism that we were talking about of relieving the pressure. So people think, oh, everything's all right. But that psychological preparedness has already taken place inside our own minds, and then they can just push the pressure back on, and we will just slip back into pandemic mode for whatever they want to do.
Right. And I think that's why we have to be very skeptical about the recent concessions and admissions that have been made by people like Rochelle Walensky, or even Albert Bourla regarding the effectiveness of the Pfizer injection. They're never going to tell us what we want to hear because they agree with what we want to hear, and they're finally seeing the light. Off Guardian recently published a really good piece about this by Kit Knightley.
It was excellent. Yeah, I read that.
This is part of their agenda, and it may be ad hoc in a way, in that it's responding to conditions they weren't planning for, but they still have an agenda. They're still going to try to further it, and if that requires pivoting to a new crisis, whether it's the climate or a cyber pandemic or some other load of bullshit, they're going for it. They've already started. They've been going for it for 2 years, and what's going to stop them now? What's to stop them now?
Well, I think we can stop them.
Right, I agree, but I'm just saying that they're fully invested, and they're not going to suddenly give up.
No, and I think they've set the stage for the cyber pandemic too with Russiagate. I mean, that was the building blocks for that.
Yeah, and it's ironic in one sense that you have something like all those kind of cyber attacks that happened in the lead up to something like the World Economic Forum's what was it called, Cyber Polygon. So you have a confusion between exercise and real world kind of event, and then you don't really know which is which. And then, you know, how easy would it be to take one of those scenarios? Perhaps they did that with COVID-19 and flip the on switch and go, right, this is going live. We're ready now. We'll go live with it.
Right.
And so something like a cyber attack that potentially, say, taking out, and we're talking about how could they introduce CBDC? Well, a cyber attack that takes out the financial system, that devalues all currency simultaneously. So suddenly your money's not worth anything. Oh God, we need a solution. What could be the solution? That use of what was it? Was it Rahm Emanuel who said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste"?
It might have been.
Yeah, I think it was. But that exact thing that they use fear and crisis as just tools of manipulation. We experience fear, we experience crisis, but for them it's just another golden set of opportunities.
Yeah.
Right.
And fear is a very powerful manipulator. It really, I mean, we're seeing it currently right now. People have lost their minds. And you know, that's a very effective way to control people, because people who are scared do not think rationally. They don't think with logic. And I think we see it all the time when politicians give speeches. They will almost always start with something fear-based, because once they have you scared, your brain shuts off. So everything else that they say after that hits a little different, you know?
Yeah. And it's also a kind of psychological technique to sort of kind of lull you into a kind of suggestible state, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
If you're kind of like you're not thinking clearly, your mind is open, then you can start putting suggestions into people's minds and getting them to think about things that otherwise they would not have contemplated. Which, I mean, one of the alarming things, and I agree with you, that we've seen during COVID-19 is the ease with which people have fallen into a fascist mindset.
Yes.
I mean, we look back, people have always sort of made the argument. I think C.J. Hopkins wrote about this as well. That, you know, we look at how was it possible that people in sort of 1930s Germany, or actually in the UK as well, because fascism was pretty popular in the UK for a while, slipped into such a vile, oppressive mindset. We kind of think, oh well, we'd never let that happen ever again. But as soon as
it's happening,
you put some fear into people and then offer them the savior, and they just fall into it again. Almost seems like it's a psychological mechanism that's embedded within us. We just, it's like falling off a log. You just put some fear into us, and we suddenly become authoritarian lunatics.
Yeah.
Demand and we want. It's almost like we want to persecute others.
Yes,
that's important. That's an important part of it. We must vent our fear and our anger somewhere. So let's vent it on that group, or let's vent it on that group.
Right.
It's very, very alarming that what's happened.
Right, and it's alarming to see who falls victim to it, if you will. A lot of people I would never have expected to fall victim to it have fallen. And you can present them with the most sound science to disprove everything they're saying, every rationale they have for taking the position they're taking, but they're impervious to it. And I just don't even bother going there with those people anymore. I don't try to interact with them or change their minds. They're lost causes. Hopefully something will wake them up, but I think it's been too long to give any more time and energy to trying to help them come around. The stakes are too high at this point, and I'm not saying they're my enemies or something like that, but we have to start looking at developing parallel societies with like-minded people as one of the ways of resisting what's going on. And I think that entails not wasting time and energy on people who are like Noam Chomsky, for example, who is totally fine.
He needs to stop talking. Stop talking, Noam. Please just stop talking. Please.
And I can't stand people who lament the fact that he's thinking and speaking that way, that he holds those beliefs. Those are the beliefs he holds. Don't feel bad about it. Ridicule him and point him out as the repugnant person he's become. Stop holding on to some nostalgia for Noam Chomsky. It's such a waste of time and energy.
Like I still have some respect for Chomsky. He was instrumental in my radicalization, reading Manufacturing Consent, listening to him speak long ago. Like I learned a lot from Noam Chomsky, but I can't follow him down this path, and I won't. So it's okay to say like I appreciate his work, and to still say he's turned into a repugnant piece of shit.
Yeah,
you know, that's okay.
I thought also we need to sort of start letting go of the cult of personality.
Yes,
well, because it's, as you said, he's done some excellent work, and you know he's been formative in lots of people's thinking. So that's valuable. It's not necessarily I mean, we do this. I mean, at the moment we've seen the thing recently, haven't we, with Joe Rogan, right? So Joe Rogan. It doesn't matter who Joe Rogan is. Everyone's saying, you know, I mean, certainly on social media, half the world seems to be saying he's a right-wing lunatic, and the other half saying, well, you've obviously never watched Joe Rogan, right? So, but the point is, it doesn't matter who Joe Rogan is or what Joe Rogan does. All that matters is the content of what he says, or more importantly, in Joe Rogan's case, the content of what he allows others to say. So it's the information that is important, and where we glean it from is neither here nor there. That's what the problem is with the left-right paradigm. We say, oh, well, I'm not listening to them because they're right-wing. Well, I'm not listening to them because they're left-wing. It's a pointless, totally reductive thing to do. All that matters is the information, the nature of the information. Is it valuable? Can I get something out of it? What is the evidence to support what this person is saying? I don't care who they are. I just want to understand the message, and I want to understand the evidence that supports that message, and I'll make my own mind up. I don't need somebody to guide me. I want to know what the information is. So, as when we're talking about someone like Chomsky, how many people now will not go back and revisit his work because they'll say, oh, I'm not listening to him because of what he said about vaccine passports and COVID?
Yeah. That's cancel culture. I hate cancel culture.
Yeah, it's mental cancel culture, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's cancel culture in our own psyche.
Yes. And I think that also goes along with the cult of personality bullshit, because it's also this sort of team mentality, this tribalism. And so everybody on my team is right and good and just and fair, and anybody who's on the other team is bad and immoral and wrong and irredeemable. And we're siloing ourselves into, you know, our little safe spaces, and it's really infantile and self-defeating. It's incredibly self-defeating. There are going to be people who you disagree with that say good things and that have good opinions, and that's okay. It's ridiculous to completely reduce somebody to, you know, one aspect of, you know, their personality. Humanity is incredibly diverse. We have a diversity of opinions and of objectives and beliefs, and that's great. That's beautiful. That should be celebrated. And so reducing somebody to like team red or team blue is, I mean, just the most self-defeating thing. But this is, again, all been intentional. I mean, all of these, we've been kind of divided. We're much easier to control and manipulate if we're in teams, and if we're fighting amongst ourselves. So this has all definitely been an intentional, you know, kind of division. They're always seeking to divide, always. And that's something I learned from Chomsky.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. I mean, but you know, it's not, it's, you know, it's everything, isn't it? It's black, white, it's rich, poor, it's left, right, it's anything, vaccinated, unvaccinated. I mean, one of the things that was, that I thought was interesting right from the beginning when the whole debate started. I mean, obviously I was strongly advocating for not being vaccinated. So I don't want a vaccine, and and I would support anybody's choice not to get one. But equally, I would support anybody's choice to get one. So if somebody wants, because there are a lot of people, I guess, on what you might call our side of the argument, who seem to be blaming the people that had taken the vaccine for allowing the narrative to continue.
Mm-hmm.
And I was kind of thinking, well, that's totally self-defeating, because if we are going to be able to move forward together as a people, as collectively as a population, then we need to be reaching out to those people to say to them, we're not denying your right to make a choice. I'm not against you making a choice. You are free to make whatever choice that you like, but please, in return, respect that goes both ways.
To say, though, I do want to say that I want them to make an informed choice. I don't think, yes, I don't think people have all of the information. I think they're being kind of manipulated into a choice. And I think a lot of people are not even, I don't even think it's necessary. I think a lot of people did it because they were told that their lives would go back to normal, and that things would go back to normal. And so they like, I mean, Jesse, for example, he chose to get the first 2 injections, and he did so for his own reason. Everybody has their own reasons, but I don't feel like a lot of people made informed choices. I am a huge personal choice person, massive. I want everybody to have their own choices, but I wish that those people could make informed choices.
I certainly didn't make an informed one, and since then I've come to realize that they've made it impossible for anybody to make an informed choice. And the only difference I'd take with what you said, Iain, and respectfully so, is that I don't advocate for, look, if somebody's going to get the injection, they're going to get it. I'm not going to physically stop them, but I have a problem with doctors like Bhattacharya, for example, who says that, who opposes mandates and lockdowns, and rightfully so, but he says that if people want to get the injection, that's their choice and they should go get it. And I think, given what we know about how harmful, how lethal these things are, that's a wrong stance, a wrong position to hold. And that doesn't mean I'm going to cancel Dr. Jay Bhattacharya because he holds that one position. But I think, if we're serious about engaging with what's going on, those nuances like that matter, because they are life or death nuances. And that's, I bring that up to illustrate that as an example where, you have your perspective, I have mine, but we can share that information, and maybe we're not going to change each other's minds, but the dialectic of that is important. That information sharing is important, and that's what strengthens our resistance.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And going back to what Missy said, that's, it's so it's informed consent. That's the important part there. So I think maybe if I rephrase what I said, I would say, if you understand that these are experimental jabs that have not got market approval, they're not approved, they've completed no clinical trials, that they're still in trials, as long as you understand that there's no evidence that they are effective or safe, but you know that and accept that, and you still understand that, and you still want to go and get the jab, it's your choice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put
it. And I'm not going to stand on a podium and say that I oppose you because you've made that choice, because I don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And I sort of railed a little bit against people that were around me that were doing that.
Yeah, but it's hard not to, given all of what we know and the way we've all been played to some extent by this pseudo pandemic. But I agree that if somebody does that, we can't consider them a lost cause. There are some people who are lost causes, and they're just not coming back from this. What
I've lost some friends.
Believe is it is a mass psychosis, despite the fact that the Twitter fact check has said it's not.
It must that must be true then.
Yeah.
The fact checker said so, guys.
The fact checker said it.
Gospel.
The AP fact checker, who I think Max Blumenthal pointed out was actually involved with Sage and Spy B in drafting the
let's terrify everyone.
The applied psychology. The
Yeah.
applied psychology that was used to terrify people.
Yeah.
One of the guys who was involved, I'm forgetting his name now, but he was one of the people that the AP fact check cited as saying there's no evidence that mass formation psychosis is going on.
And didn't they also, during the Trump years, put out something about how all of Trump's supporters were under some form of mass psychosis? And so it's like under Trump, that's a thing. But then under now, it's a conspiracy theory.
Yeah.
I mean,
Max Blumenthal pointed that out on Twitter, and I thought that was a really good find on his part.
Yes.
But of course, the existence of such a thing as a fact checker kind of proves that there must be mass psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
Why would anybody accept such a thing as a fact checker? I mean, what a crazy concept.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole idea that I'm going to devolve my critical thinking to some third party, right? Unnamed third party.
No.
My mind, I no longer have any control over my mind or my own thoughts. I'm just going to park that with some corporation who will do my thinking for me, and they will tell me what is true and what is not true, and I will just follow whatever they say, because I mean that is mass psychosis.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if people are going along with that, that's crazy. That's craziness.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's a good place to wrap. I think we covered a lot of fruitful ground there. And I think the takeaway, one of the many takeaways here, is that we have to, as Ryan Christian says, stay vigilant and question everything and resist. Don't comply with what these globalist maniacs are trying to foist upon us. As we sit here and speak right now, they're having their online soiree to decide our fates, and we ought not to accept it because it's anti-human what they're pushing. It's really anti-human and against everything that has to do with harmony, with solidarity, with loving one another as equal human beings. These are very sick people, and we can see that, I think, in what we discussed today. The fact that they're trying to marketize essentially the universe, and that they think they can actually do it.
Shows they think they can do it. Yeah,
shows you how off the rails they are.
The hubris, man.
It's incredible.
Yes.
It's incredible.
Yeah. So I'm going to drop for everybody in the chat the link again one more time to the article that we discussed, but then also a link to Iain's website. He mentioned that he has a book. You can get that book on his website. So I'm going to drop that in the chat for everybody, so you can go. All you have to do is subscribe, and you can get access to his book, which is amazing. So I'm dropping those links in chat right now for everybody. There we go. And then, is there anything that you have coming up that you want to tell everybody about, or is there?
No, I'm just continuing to write, and I've got a few articles coming up. I'm doing a fact check of a fact checker, so I just couldn't resist it. And please, check out my website. You put the links in, but it's in this together. I sort of regularly write and started to appear occasionally on UK Column, which I would, especially for UK-based people, that they've been really solid throughout this whole thing. And also Whitney Webb's Unlimited Hangout as well. Hopefully write some more articles for Whitney. And it's just been a one thing I would say in terms of resistance, in terms of what we can do in terms of resistance, it's just the little things that we do every day. If we make a conscious decision every day that we're going to make whatever we do, we're going to step towards freedom and away from tyranny. If every little decision, like what we buy, where we buy it from, how we travel, what we're going to, if in the back of our mind we've got a consistent approach that we want to step towards freedom and away from tyranny, then collectively that is what will happen. If we all do that, that is what will happen. It's not a debatable as a fact, because that's why they're using behavioral change on us, because they understand the power of behavioral change. So all we need to do is flip that on its head and consistently work towards freedom, and we'll get there.
Well said. Yeah, well said. I like that. Step towards freedom and away from tyranny. That should be everybody's motto moving forward.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Iain, and thank you so much for the work that you do. It's been a lodestar for me in a lot of ways, and I think you're a fundamental voice pushing back against this new normal nightmare narrative. And again, thank you for all that you do.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yes, of course. And thanks to everybody in the chat for hanging out with us. We appreciate you guys as well. Make sure you check out Iain's website. You can follow him on Twitter. It's up on the screen now, his handle. And we will see you all again real soon. Bye, guys.